The silence in the wake of a life once shared is not merely the absence of sound. It is a heavy, suffocating weight that settles into the marrow of your bones. For Elena, that silence had become her only companion since the sudden passing of her husband, Marcus. They had spent 25 years weaving their lives together, a tapestry of shared dreams and quiet mornings, only for the thread to be violently severed, leaving her adrift in a world that felt suddenly alien and cold. The inheritance he left behind was modest, a reflection of a life lived with integrity rather than excess, but it represented the final physical tether to their partnership. It was a sum that whispered of security, yet felt like a burden of memories she could no longer carry in the hollow halls of their suburban home. Every corner of that house was a ghost, every scent a reminder of what was gone. She needed to run, not from his memory, but from the stagnation of her own grief. That was when she saw the listing, a forgotten estate nestled in the rugged heart of the countryside, a place the locals called the Whispering Willows. The photos showed a skeletal structure, a farmhouse that had long ago surrendered its dignity to the encroaching forest. It was a ruin, a skeleton of wood and stone, isolated by miles of winding dirt roads and ancient, gnarled trees. To anyone else, it was a liability, a money pit, a fool's errand. But to Elena, it looked like a mirror. It was broken, abandoned, and hidden away, just like her. She bought it sight unseen, pouring nearly every cent of the inheritance into the deed, ignoring the concerned calls from her lawyer and the confused whispers of her neighbors. She didn't want a renovation project. She wanted a sanctuary where the world couldn't find her, a place where she could finally let the walls of her heart crumble alongside the walls of the house. As she drove the long, lonely miles toward her new life, the city skyline fading into a blur of gray in the rearview mirror, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months, a grim, determined spark of purpose. She arrived as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the overgrown driveway. The house loomed out of the twilight, more derelict than the pictures had suggested. The porch groaned under her weight, a warning or a welcome. She couldn't tell. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting cedar. She stood there, a lone figure against the vast, darkening landscape, clutching the rusted key that felt like a heavy anchor in her palm. She believed she was finally alone, truly and utterly alone, ready to fade away into the quiet decay of the countryside. She thought her story had reached its final, lonely chapter, a quiet coda to a life that had lost its melody. But as she turned the key in the lock, the heavy oak door creaking open to reveal a hallway choked with dust and shadows, she had no way of knowing that the silence of the willows was an illusion. She had come here to bury her past, but the land had a memory of its own, and the shadows within those walls were already watching, waiting for the woman who thought she had nothing left to lose. Little did she know, the inheritance wasn't just the money or the land. It was a gateway to a secret that Marcus had never mentioned, a legacy hidden beneath the floorboards and behind the ivy-choked stone. Her journey of solitude was about to become a crowded path of discovery, for in the heart of this ruin, life was stirring in ways she could never have imagined. This was not the end of her story. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and unexpected transformation. The widow had bought a grave for her grief, but she was about to find a garden of secrets. The first night at the Whispering Willows was not a sleep of peace, but a vigil of shadows. Elena stepped over the threshold, the air inside the house feeling 10 degrees colder than the evening breeze she had left behind. It was a stagnant, heavy cold that seemed to cling to her skin like a damp shroud. Her flashlight beam, a solitary sword of white light, sliced through the darkness, revealing a hallway that looked like it hadn't breathed in decades. Thick, gray cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered lace, swaying slightly in the draft she had created by opening the door. Every step she took on the warped floorboards produced a sharp, agonizing groan that echoed through the empty chambers, a sound that felt less like old wood and more like a protest from the house itself. She made her way to the kitchen, the supposed heart of the home, only to find a skeletal remains of a room. A massive cast-iron stove sat in the corner, a rusted monument to meals cooked by hands long since turned to dust. The smell of damp earth was stronger here, mingling with the metallic tang of old pipes and something sweeter, something like dried lavender buried under a mountain of rot. She set her small bag on the dust-caked table, the sound thudding heavily in the silence. She felt like an intruder in a tomb, a trespasser on a history she didn't yet understand. As she moved to clear a small space to sit, her light caught something peculiar, a series of deep, rhythmic scratches on the doorframe leading to the pantry. They weren't the random marks of shifting furniture or the gnawing of rodents. They were deliberate, grouped in sets of 4, carved deep into the dark oak. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She told herself it was nothing, just the remnants of a previous owner's life, perhaps a tally of days or a child's forgotten game. But the marks felt urgent, desperate. She forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the practicalities of survival. She had no power, no running water, only the supplies she had brought in her car. As she reached for her water bottle, a sudden, sharp clink echoed from the floorboards beneath her feet. It was the sound of metal hitting stone, distinct and deliberate. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt physical, pressing against her ears. She lowered her flashlight, the beam illuminating the gaps between the wide pine planks. There, wedged in a crack that seemed too narrow to hold anything, was a glint of silver. Kneeling, her joints protesting the cold, she used a small pocket knife to pry the object loose. It was a tarnished silver locket, heavy and cold. As she rubbed away the grime, a name began to emerge from the metal. Evelina. Her hands trembled. Her own name was Elena, a modern variation of the same root. Was this a coincidence, or a haunting echo? If you are feeling the chill of this mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the secrets we're about to uncover in this house. She tried to snap the locket open, but the hinge was fused shut by years of oxidation and dirt. Just as she was about to set it down, a soft, rhythmic thumping began. It wasn't coming from outside, nor from the wind. It was coming from directly beneath her, a slow, steady vibration that felt like a heartbeat pulsing through the very foundation of the cottage. Thump, thump, thump. It was rhythmic, biological, and utterly impossible. She pressed her palm to the floor, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the wood felt warm. She recoiled as if burned, her flashlight flickering for a terrifying moment before stabilizing. She wasn't alone. The house wasn't just a ruin, it was a vessel, and something was breathing inside its walls. Fear, sharp and cold, warred with an inexplicable curiosity. Marcus had always said she was too brave for her own good, and now, in the silence of the willows, that bravery felt like a death sentence. The vibration beneath Elena's palms didn't just stop. It faded into a low, mournful hum that seemed to vibrate in her very teeth. It was a frequency of sorrow, a physical manifestation of a secret that had been buried far too deep for far too long. She stood up, her legs shaking like reeds in a storm, the silver locket still clutched so tightly in her fist that the metal bit into her skin. She should leave. Every instinct honed by years of rational living screamed at her to run back to the car, to drive until the gas ran out, to find a brightly lit motel, and never look back. But the grief she had carried for Marcus had changed her. It had hollowed her out, leaving a space where fear used to live, now filled with a desperate, reckless need for answers. If this house was a mirror of her soul, then the heartbeat beneath the floor was a sign that she wasn't as dead inside as she believed. She grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from beside the rusted stove, using it as a lever. She began to wedge the tip into the gap where she had found the locket, the wood shrieking in protest. The sound was deafening in the stagnant air, a violent intrusion into the house's long slumber. With a heave that strained every muscle in her back, a large section of the floorboards gave way, splintering and cracking to reveal not dirt, but a dark, narrow void. The beam of her flashlight plunged into the hole, illuminating a set of stone stairs, steep and slick with moisture, descending into a darkness that felt ancient. This wasn't a basement. It was a cellar carved directly into the bedrock of the earth, a hidden chamber that didn't appear on any of the blueprints she had studied. The air rising from the opening was different. It didn't smell of rot or damp cedar. It smelled of ozone, old paper, and something sharply medicinal, like a doctor's office from a century ago. Elena took a shuddering breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She began to descend, each step a gamble against the slick, moss-covered stone. As she reached the bottom, the flashlight beams swept across a room that defied every expectation. It was a laboratory of sorts, but one frozen in time. Glass beakers, clouded with age, sat on heavy oak workbenches. Leather-bound journals were stacked in precarious towers, their spines cracked and peeling. But it was the far wall that stopped her heart. A massive, intricate map of the surrounding woods was pinned there, but it wasn't a topographical map. It was a web of names, dates, and strange, geometric symbols, all connected by red string that looked like veins pulsing under the flickering light. And there, at the very center of the map, circled in thick, dark ink, was her own name, Elena. Not Evelina, the name on the locket, but her name. Next to it was a date, the exact date of her arrival at the estate. Her breath hitched, a cold realization dawning on her. This wasn't a random purchase. This wasn't a coincidence born of grief. She had been led here, steered by a hand she hadn't seen, toward a destiny she didn't choose. If you're as shocked as Elena is right now, drop a comment below with what you think Marcus was hiding. The room felt like it was closing in. She turned her light toward a small, wooden desk in the corner, where a single, fresh envelope sat atop a pile of dust. It was pristine, white, and bore her name in a handwriting she knew better than her own. It was Marcus's handwriting. The ink was dark, the strokes confident and elegant, exactly as he used to write his grocery lists and love notes. But Marcus had been dead for 6 months. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the flashlight as she reached for the letter. The paper felt heavy, expensive, and impossibly new. As she broke the wax seal, a seal bearing the same geometric symbol from the map, a small, dried flower fell out. It was a sprig of lavender, the same scent she had smelled upstairs. She unfolded the parchment, her eyes blurring. The words on the page didn't just sit there. They seemed to vibrate, searing themselves into Elena's retina. "My dearest Elena," the letter began, the ink so fresh it almost looked wet under the harsh glare of her flashlight. "If you are reading this, it means you have found the courage to embrace the silence I left behind. I know you feel abandoned. I know the weight of the inheritance felt like a hollow consolation. But this house, this ruin, is not a grave for our memories. It is the foundation of your survival." Elena's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto a dusty wooden stool, the cold air of the cellar swirling around her like a living thing. Marcus was dead. She had seen the casket lowered. She had felt the finality of the earth hitting the wood. Yet, here was his voice, clear and resonant, speaking to her from a past she never knew existed. The letter continued, detailing a history that made her head spin. Marcus hadn't just been a quiet accountant with a penchant for old books. He was the last guardian of a lineage that stretched back centuries, a lineage tied to the very soil of the Whispering Willows. He explained that the estate sat upon a thin place, a geographical anomaly where the veil between what is known and what is hidden was dangerously translucent. The heartbeat she had felt wasn't a ghost, but the rhythmic resonance of a subterranean spring that reacted to the presence of those tied to the land by blood or intent. He wrote of a great restoration, not of the house, but of a knowledge that had been systematically erased by those who feared the power of the natural world. "The money I left you," the letter read, "was never meant for your comfort, Elena. It was a dowry for the earth. Every cent was calculated to bring you here, at this exact moment, when the alignment is right." She looked back at the map on the wall, the red strings suddenly looking less like a web and more like a map of a circulatory system. Her name sat at the center of a convergence she didn't understand. The symbols, triangles interlaced with circles and strange, flowing script, began to glow faintly in her peripheral vision, or perhaps it was just the strain on her eyes. The letter warned her of the Observers, a group that had hunted his family for generations, seeking the secrets hidden beneath the willows. They will come for the widow, he warned, because they think you are the weak link in the chain. They do not know that I chose you, because you are the strongest person I have ever known. You don't just endure grief, Elena. You transform it. A sudden, sharp metallic scrape echoed from the floorboards directly above her head. The kitchen. It wasn't the rhythmic thumping from before. It was the sound of a heavy boot dragging across the wood, followed by the unmistakable click of a door latch. Someone was in the house. The realization turned her blood to ice. She wasn't just a grieving widow in a fixer-upper. She was a target in a sanctuary that had suddenly become a cage. She looked at the letter again, searching for a way out, a weapon, a sign. At the very bottom, in tiny, cramped script, was a postscript. Look behind the map, where the lavender meets the stone. Do not scream. They listen for fear. Elena extinguished her flashlight, plunging herself into a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. She held her breath, her ears straining. Above, the footsteps were slow, deliberate, and multiple. 2, maybe 3 people were moving through the kitchen, their voices muffled murmurs that sounded like static. She reached out in the dark, her fingers brushing the cold, damp stone of the wall, searching for the sprig of lavender she had dropped. Her hand found the edge of the massive map, the paper dry and brittle. As she pulled it back, her fingers encountered a hidden recess, and within it, something cold, heavy, and metallic. It wasn't a gun, but a heavy, ancient-looking key, much larger than the one for the front. The heavy iron key felt unnaturally warm in Elena's hand, a stark contrast to the subterranean chill that had settled into her joints. It was intricately carved, its surface etched with the same geometric pattern she had seen on the map and in Marcus's letter. Above her, the floorboards groaned under the weight of the intruders. The murmurs had stopped, replaced by a terrifying, methodical silence, the sound of predators who knew their prey was cornered but hadn't yet found the trapdoor. She knew she had mere minutes, perhaps seconds, before they discovered the splintered wood in the kitchen. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but Marcus's words echoed in her mind. They listen for fear. She forced her breathing to slow, drawing the damp, ozone-heavy air deep into her lungs, trying to transmute her terror into the cold, sharp focus her husband had always admired. If you're holding your breath along with Elena, make sure to like this video and subscribe to see if she makes it out of the cellar. With trembling fingers, she felt along the back of the stone recess where she had found the key. Her touch brushed against a small, circular indentation in the bedrock, perfectly sized for the key's barrel. As she inserted the iron tool and turned it, there was no sound of grinding gears or clicking tumblers. Instead, a low, tectonic hum vibrated through the floor, and a section of the stone wall, seamless and ancient, slid backward with the silence of a ghost. Behind the stone lay a narrow, spiraling staircase carved directly into the earth, descending even deeper into the foundations of the estate. A faint, bioluminescent glow emanated from the walls, a soft azure light provided by a strange, mossy growth that clung to the damp rock. It was beautiful and alien, a secret world thriving beneath the decay of the house above. Elena stepped through the opening just as a thunderous crash echoed from the kitchen, the sound of the heavy oak table being shoved aside. They had found the hole. She didn't hesitate. She stepped onto the first stair and pressed a small, protruding stone on the inner side of the passage. The heavy door slid back into place with a muted thud, sealing her in a tomb of blue light and ancient silence, just as a shout of discovery erupted from the cellar above. She was safe for now, but she was also descending into the unknown, leaving the world she knew for a labyrinth of shadows and legacy. The air down here was different. It felt charged, electric, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with the history Marcus had died to protect. As she descended, the stairs opened into a vast, vaulted chamber that took her breath away. It wasn't a laboratory or a cellar, but a library of life. Thousands of glass jars lined the walls, each containing a different seed, a different dried flower, or a glowing liquid that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light. In the center of the room stood a stone plinth, and upon it sat a heavy, silver-bound book, its cover embossed with the same locket design she had found earlier. This was the true inheritance. Not the money, not the crumbling house, but the great restoration Marcus had written about. This was a sanctuary of lost knowledge, a genetic and spiritual vault designed to survive a world that had forgotten how to listen to the earth. Elena approached the plinth, her footsteps silent on the soft, moss-covered floor. She realized then that her grief hadn't just been a void, it had been a pruning, a stripping away of everything non-essential so that she could be ready for this moment. She wasn't just a widow, she was a successor. But the weight of the responsibility was staggering. How could she, a woman who had lost everything, protect a secret that had been hidden for centuries? As she reached out to touch the silver book, a voice, not a whisper in her head, but a clear, resonant sound in the room, spoke her name. Elena, you are late. She spun around, her heart leaping into he. The voice didn't come from the shadows, but from the very center of the illuminated chamber. Standing near a secondary archway was a woman who looked as if she had been carved from the same ancient stone as the walls. She was elderly, her face a map of deep-set wrinkles that told stories of decades spent away from the sun, yet her eyes were a piercing, vibrant violet that seemed to hold the light of the glowing jars. She wore a heavy, dark cloak that shimmered with a subtle, metallic weave, and in her hand, she held a staff of polished rowan wood. Elena froze, her hand hovering inches above the silver-bound book. The terror she had felt upstairs, the fear of the men with heavy boots, was suddenly replaced by a profound, vibrating awe. This wasn't a ghost. This was the physical manifestation of the legacy Marcus had died to protect. Who are you? Elena managed to whisper, her voice cracking in the pressurized air of the vault. The woman stepped forward, the soft moss dampening the sound of her footsteps. I am Clara, she replied, her voice like the sound of grinding stones smoothed by a river. I am the archivist. And you, Elena, are the one we have been waiting for since the first frost of last winter. Marcus spoke of your resilience, but seeing you stand here after what you've endured, it is different. Backslash, and Clara gestured to the vast library of jars and the silver book. You think you came here to hide, to let the world forget you. But Marcus knew that the only way to heal a broken heart is to give it a purpose larger than its own pain. This is the repository of the verdant thread. For centuries, our kind has preserved the seeds of the old world, not just the plants, but the frequencies of life that the modern world is trying to drown out. The men above, the ones you heard, they are the harvesters of silence. They want to commodify the very essence of growth, to own the blueprints of nature. They believe this estate is just a plot of land, but it is the anchor point for a network that spans the globe. Elena looked at the silver book, the locket she had found earlier now feeling like a heavy, warm coal in her pocket. She realized the locket wasn't just a memento, it was a key, a physical link to the women who had stood in this vault before her. Marcus, he was part of this? She asked, the grief for her husband taking on a new, complex layer of pride and betrayal. Backslash, and he was the guardian, Clara said, bowing her head slightly. He kept the surface world at bay while I tended the roots. But the cycle is turning, Elena. The harvesters are getting closer. They knew Marcus was fading, and they thought his death would leave the willows vulnerable. They didn't count on his inheritance being passed to someone with your fire. Elena looked up at the ceiling, imagining the men pacing the kitchen floorboards just a few dozen feet above them. They felt small now, insignificant compared to the weight of the history surrounding her. But they were still dangerous, still armed, and still searching. What do I have to do? Elena asked, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't felt since before Marcus's funeral. Clara smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made the violet in her eyes glow brighter. You have to stop being the widow who lost everything and start being the woman who inherits the earth. The book on the plinth contains the rite of awakening. If the harvesters breach the stone door, we must be ready to trigger the restoration. It will change this land forever, Elena. It will make the willows invisible to those with malice in their hearts, but it requires a sacrifice of memory. You must be willing to let go of the Marcus you knew, to embrace the Marcus who is a titan of this world. And Elena reached out and finally touched the silver cover of the book. The moment her skin met the metal, a jolt of energy surged through her, a kaleidoscope of images flashing behind her eyelids, forests growing in seconds, river. The surge of energy wasn't a shock, it was a homecoming. As Elena's palm connected with the cold, embossed silver of the book, the cellar around her seemed to dissolve into a swirling vortex of emerald and gold. She wasn't just seeing images, she was experiencing them. She felt the ancient roots of the great willows stretching deep into the mantle of the earth, drinking from subterranean rivers of pure, unadulterated life. She saw Marcus, not as the frail man she had nursed in his final days, but as a towering figure of light, standing guard at the threshold of this very vault, his face etched with a love so profound it transcended the grave. He hadn't kept this from her out of a lack of trust, but to protect the purity of her spirit until the moment she was strong enough to carry the weight of the world's hidden heartbeat. The grief that had been a leaden weight in her chest for 6 months began to crack, and from those fissures, a new kind of power emerged, a fierce, protective instinct that burned hotter than any sorrow. "I see it now," she whispered, her voice no longer trembling, but resonating with the same tectonic frequency as the house itself. "I see the thread." Above her, the muffled thuds of the harvesters grew more frantic. A heavy, metallic clanging suggested they were using sledgehammers against the stone floor of the kitchen, desperate to break through the seal. The vibration rattled the glass jars on the shelves, a cacophony of tinkling crystal that sounded like a warning. Clara stepped closer, her violet eyes reflecting the ethereal light emanating from the book. "The rite of awakening is not a spell, Elena. It is an alignment. You must channel the inheritance, not the gold, but the vital essence Marcus stored for you, into the foundation stones. You are the conduit. If you are finding this journey as intense as Elena is, don't forget to subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to find their own strength." Elena closed her eyes, ignoring the chaos above. She reached deep into the reservoir of her memories, finding the moments of purest connection she had shared with Marcus, the quiet sunrises, the shared laughter, the unspoken understanding. She took that love and, instead of mourning its loss, she offered it as fuel. She felt the silver book pulse beneath her hand, the geometric patterns on the cover beginning to spin. The bioluminescent moss on the walls flared into a blinding azure brilliance, and the air in the chamber began to hum with a sound like 1,000 bees. The great restoration was beginning. She could feel the land outside the house responding. The gnarled willows began to straighten, their leaves turning a vibrant, impossible silver. The thin place was thickening, weaving a barrier of ancient energy that would make the estate vanish from the maps of the greedy. But as the power peaked, a jagged crack appeared in the ceiling of the vault. Dust and debris rained down as a heavy iron pry bar forced its way through the stone. The harvesters were through. A man's face, obscured by a tactical mask, peered down into the blue-lit sanctuary, his eyes widening in a mixture of greed and terror. Elena didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her hand still fused to the book, her hair whipping around her face in a wind that came from nowhere. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the storm. The man shouted something to his companions, a command to descend, but as he reached for the edge of the opening, the very stone seemed to ripple like water. The house was no longer a ruin. It was a living organism, and it was defending its new queen. Elena felt the final barrier of her old life fall away. She was no longer just a widow. She was the guardian of the Whispering Willows, and the inheritance was finally, truly, hers to command. The shadows of the past were being burned away by the light of a future she never dared to dream of, a future where she would never be alone again, for the earth itself was. The man's hand, gloved in black leather and trembling with a mix of avarice and sudden, primal fear, slipped from the edge of the jagged opening. The stone didn't just ripple, it exhaled. A wave of concussive, emerald light surged upward from the heart of the vault, a physical manifestation of the great restoration that Elena had unleashed. The intruders were not merely pushed back, they were expelled. The house, once a skeletal ruin of rotting cedar and damp earth, began to knit itself back together with a terrifying, beautiful speed. Upstairs, the splintered floorboards of the kitchen fused into a seamless expanse of polished oak. The rusted cast-iron stove glowed with a sudden, internal warmth, and the heavy oak door slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the valley, sealing the harvesters outside in the cold, indifferent night. They were gone, vanished into the thickening mist that now swirled around the perimeter of the estate, a mist that would ensure no one who did not belong would ever find the path to the Whispering Willows again. In the silence that followed, a silence no longer heavy with grief, but vibrating with potential, Elena finally let go of the silver book. Her hand felt warm, the geometric patterns of the cover now faintly etched into her skin like a golden brand of sovereignty. Clara, the archivist, stepped forward, her violet eyes dimming to a soft, comforting glow. "It is done," the old woman whispered, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of relief. "The anchor is set. The lineage is secure." Elena looked around the chamber, seeing not a tomb of secrets, but a nursery for the future. The inheritance Marcus had left her was never about the currency of men. It was about the currency of life itself. She realized now that her husband hadn't died to leave her behind. He had died to lead her here, to the one place where her brokenness could become a bridge. She walked toward the spiraling staircase, her footsteps now in perfect harmony with the rhythmic thrumming of the earth. As she emerged back into the kitchen, the morning sun was beginning to bleed through the newly restored windows, casting long, golden fingers across the room. The dust was gone. The smell of rot had been replaced by the overwhelming, sweet scent of blooming lavender and fresh rain. She stood at the window, looking out at the gnarled willows that were now lush with silver-green leaves, their branches swaying in a dance of gratitude. She was alone in the physical sense, yes, but she had never felt more crowded by presence. The house was alive, the land was breathing, and the spirit of Marcus was woven into the very air she inhaled. She had bought a ruin to bury her heart, but she had found a throne. The widow who had arrived in darkness was now the guardian who stood in the light. Her journey of solitude had ended, replaced by a sacred duty that would span the rest of her days. As she reached into her pocket and felt the cool silver of the locket, she knew that the Whispering Willows would never be silent again. They would tell her stories of the earth, of the seeds of the old world, and of the love that had been strong enough to build a sanctuary across the divide of death. If this story of transformation and hidden legacies touched your soul, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you discovered your inheritance was a gateway to another world? Elena's story is just one thread in a much larger tapestry, and we are so grateful you joined us for this awakening. The restoration is complete, but for Elena, the real work, the beautiful, terrifying, and vital work of the Guardian, is only just beginning. She stepped out onto the porch, the wood firm and strong beneath her feet, and for the first time in a long, long time, Elena smiled at the rising sun.